Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jose David Saldivar, and I'm the director of the Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity and a professor in the Department of Comparative Literature. And I'm really delighted to welcome all of you to our book salon, our Chautauqua, where we get to actually talk about books. It's always a great thing, I think, to talk about books, given that many times when we're not teaching, we're in meetings talking about other things. And to welcome you to our Chautauqua featuring our CCSRE Research Fellow, Professor Hazel Rose Marcus. Professor Marcus will be in conversation with Professor Prudence Carter, who is the director of the RIXRE program. So I think we're really in for a real treat today to get a real discussion about the global South, the global North, about our complicated, multiple, contradictory selves, our independent selves and our interdependent selves. And I guess Hazel paid me a compliment by saying that, I was a lot like Barack Obama after I did my chart, that I may be a transformational leader in that sense. So that's great. Just for that, I read the book twice.
Now you'll just order 500 or 600 copies for your friends.
That's right. So, as I said, we're going to be in for a real treat over the discussion of clash, 8 cultural conflicts that make us who we are. And I'd now like to invite our Associate Director, Maria Mohammedini, who will say a few words because Hazel is her mentor.
Thanks so much, Jose David, and I would also like to welcome everyone for coming today. Now, I wanted to say another word too about the Chautauquas. We really want these to be informal and fun events, so please feel free, say hi to your neighbors, get up and get some more food or another glass of wine while you're here, and just, jump in and discuss and debate during our discussion portion of the event. Now, before I turn it over to Prudence Carter to introduce Hazel, I'd also like to take this chance to welcome all of our faculty fellows for the year who are here today. So please first join me in congratulating Richard Ford. He's the George E. Osborne Professor of Law at the Stanford Law School. And we hope you can join us on February 6th during winter quarter to discuss his recent book, Rights Gone Wrong, How Law Corrupts the Struggle for Equality. So please join me in congratulating Richard Ford. And also, I'd like to introduce our next fellow, who's Corey Fields. He's over here in the corner. And please, we hope you can join us on May 1st to discuss his new book manuscript, Black Elephants in the Room, Race and the Unexpected Politics of African American Republicans. And Corey's joining us. He's an assistant professor of sociology and CCSRE, and we hope you can join us in the spring. So join me in congratulating Corey. Now, I just can't resist. As Jose David mentioned, Hazel was my graduate advisor, and I really want to tell you all a quick story about Hazel. Now, and I'm full of them, of course, because I know her well. And you may not know this about her, but one of her great talents is the ability to turn complex, theoretical, really groundbreaking ideas into quirky quips or catchy kind of soundbite phrases. She has a real talent for this. So some of her most famous sayings are, "You can't be a self by yourself." Americans, they just need to get over their big fat selves. And you think, therefore I am. So a nice spin on Descartes there. Now, after clash, I think we can also add to the list. Lead with your inner Mother Teresa, but when you need to, throw down with your inner Bill Gates. and she'll discuss more about those different selves that are in all of us and how we can harness them to our advantage. And I really think her talent to communicate these big ideas is what really shines through in clash and serves to increase its appeal to both academic audiences like ours, but also popular audiences as well. So let me now turn it over to Prudence Carter. She's our director of our research institute, and Prudence is a professor of education and by courtesy sociology in the Graduate School of Education. And with the many hats that she wears, she's also the director of the John W. Gardner Center for Youth and Their Communities in the School of Education. And as a scholar of race, of inequality, and also, excuse me, I have a cold and my throat is getting a little funny, and also dynamics of straddling multicultural worlds. She's really ideally suited to be our moderator today, so please join me in welcoming Prudence Carter.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon. Hi.
It's so nice to see you all on this wet, and well, it's misty, not so rainy at this moment, but it's a good day to be inside talking about a book. It's a good day to be a nerd, right? So I'm so happy because I'm get to dialogue today with my friend league, Hazel Marcus. You know, I had a good time reading this book, so I'm excited to be engaging with her and with you around this book. And it's, I just want to, in case you don't know, everybody tells me that everyone knows Hazel on this campus, so I don't think I have to say that much. But after reading Clash, I now think of her as the queen of knowing thyself. Like, so I was walking around these last 2 days, know thyself, and know thyself in different contexts, because I think that really gets to the gist of this book. But let me just be a little bit more formal and tell you that Hazel Rose Marcus is the Davis Brack Professor in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University. And she is indeed one of the leading countries and world's leading experts on the role of self in regulating behavior and on the ways in which the self is shaped by the social world. She has developed many concepts of self-schemas and possible selves, and that is very evident also in the book that we'll discuss today. And this work of hers shows how the self system organizes perception, reasoning, and memory, and reveals the constructive role of the self throughout the life course. She has conducted a host of experimental and survey studies, some very creative ones with her colleagues and her graduate students. And I tell you, she has a number of honors and accolades that recognize the incredible work that she's done, including being elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 1994. And in 2008, she received the American Psychological Association's Award for Distinguished Scientific Contribution. And she has also served in the capacity that I serve in. I mean, she was a predecessor as the research director for the Research Institute for the Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity. And so I tell you, I had really big shoes to step into, and I don't even know if I filled them yet, but certainly I'm trying, Hazel. It's so wonderful for me to be able to welcome you to this podium today and to share with your colleagues, to share with us your community, really. This is a great community to be a part of, I hope. And I'm looking forward to this. So please join me in welcoming Hazel Rose Marcus.
Well, it's great to be here on any day, especially on a rainy day, but to be in this room, to be in a CCSRE, a RICSRE event, there's no better place to be. I feel the energy of all the other meetings that we've had in this room, and what I'm going to talk about today is an interdependent, a collaborative product with so many people that are here, and I just look out there and see some of the first, and I see Dorothy Steele, I see Claude Steele, I see Al Camarillo, I see Paula Moya, just to name the, what should I say, the oldest, my oldest, not the ones I've known the longest in terms of, I'm digging myself deeper here, the ones I've been connected to the longest, and just by way of saying that everything that I will say here, to the extent it strikes you as right or wrong, is a collaborative product that comes from just decades of conversation with them. But mostly I feel so safe here because CCSRE has made that place at Stanford University where you do not have to be afraid to talk about these ideas, and you don't need to be afraid to maybe say it wrong. You know, you just say it, and then your colleagues help adjust you and correct you, and mostly you feel safe in a shared mission that we're making a difference, and we have made a difference in the 20 years that I've been here, and we're really taking off now. So thank you guys for thinking of this Chautauqua sort of event. I think it's wonderful. It seems perfect. So let me see, where should I start today? I think I want to start with the fact that we wrote this book, Elena and I should say that Elena Connor is a former graduate student who's now a science writer and communications consultant, and she is the executive director of SPARK, which is a new center we have in psychology. SPARK stands for Social Psychological Answers to Real World Questions. It's the SPARK with a Q. And we wrote this book together in answer to many people saying the world is so complex, it's so diverse, there's so much multicultural everything. I just want to put the covers over my head. And when in any venue you find people that are just throwing up their hands, they don't know what to do. And often when they don't know what to do, people think, well, maybe the best thing to do would be to ignore it altogether and just be colorblind. So we were trying to write a book that would be a tool, a way to get a handle on some of the diversity, to make sense of some of the diversity. So the first response isn't to run away. And I'm just seeing that I need my power cord for this. Let me put this in. I should have done that before. And so we started, and for me, the diversity and the complexity and the problems became clear. This has to be just right. I think for me, even as a professor of culture, of social psychology, I was very very tuned into diversity. I found that teaching at Stanford was getting increasingly complex. So what was working for one student often worked really well to inspire or motivate one student, all of a sudden wouldn't work at all with another student. It would fall completely flat, or maybe even would just blow up altogether. And I started to become more aware of how, yeah, that's good, that's perfect. Of this diversity, and to think what to do about it. Let me give you an example. One of my first and really strong examples was from a then graduate student. She was Hee-jung Kim, and she was from Korea, and she came from Seoul to go to graduate school. And so she sat in our lab, 15 or so people, and of course everybody was expected, as they are in graduate student labs, to contribute, and it was clear at the beginning of the quarter that's what you needed to do. And twice a week this was meeting, I would call on her, Hee-jung, don't you have something to add? And she stares at her hands. And then the next week I would say, come on, Hee-jung, I could read your paper, I know, chime in here, let's get the conversation going. Nothing, says nothing, or says, she said, I have nothing to say today. So about the 5th or 6th week into the quarter, I noticed that on her signature line, Hee-jung had written what turned out to be an old Korean proverb, the empty carriage rattles the loudest. And it took a while for me to get the point of what she was saying, and it was what she understood very well, which is those who have a lot to say often have the least to say. And she went on to do a brilliant set of studies. She's now a professor at the University of California, Santa Barbara, but for her dissertation that showed that for Korean Americans who had grown up speaking English, talking and thinking impair each other. Talking gets in the way of thinking for Korean Americans. And it's just the opposite for Americans with a European background. In fact, talking enhances their thinking. And indeed, that's what that's how we encourage students. That's why we encourage them in class. So as I got to know Hee-jung better, I came to realize that she grew up in classrooms that looked like this one. Students were encouraged to sit calmly with quiet minds. They were supposed to pay close attention to what the teacher was saying so that they could adjust their thinking to what the teacher was saying, to fit with what the teacher was saying. It's not that you don't question, it's not that you don't have other thoughts, but that comes later, after you've absorbed what the teacher has to say. The idea is to make a clear mind so that you can absorb what's coming in. Now, the trouble was, the classrooms I grew up in and the ones that most of the other students in the lab, they grew up in classrooms that looked more like this. You know, where students, and you all know those kids, you know, they got their hand in the hair, then they think of what they're gonna say. But that's what they're supposed to do, you know, they're supposed to hone their unique ideas, they're supposed to freely express their thoughts, maybe even, not only just absorb what the teacher says, maybe they're supposed to get their ideas out there and influence what the teacher is saying, because that's the whole critical thinking, that's the debate. Now, of course, these classroom differences aren't just one-off classroom differences, they reflect deep cultural, philosophical, historical differences about what it means to be a person, what it means to be a good person, what it means to be a smart person, what it means to think and feel and act. Just look at these sayings. In the West, we say, the squeaky wheel gets the grease, right? It's a very clear summary of if you want me to know what you're thinking, you better say out loud. What am I supposed to do? Read your mind? We often say things like that. In the East, there are many, many versions of this. The duck that squawks the loudest gets shot. They say the tall poppy gets sheared off, or they say the nail that sticks out stands down, gets pounded down. What is this sense? It's not that you shouldn't show yourself, it's just that standing out carries with it some dangers. You can be vulnerable, especially until you know the rules of the game, until you know what's going on. Making a big scene of yourself could be dangerous, so it might not be a smart strategy. So in this same lab, and Mariam will remember this, there was many students, well she came later but she knows of these students, was the student who turns out to be the author of this book, Elena Connor. Now Elena had grown up in some place less exotic than Seoul, South Korea, but still kind of exotic to me, which was Memphis, and Memphis is mostly known for, you know, sightings of the ghost of Elvis Presley. But Elena, that's about what I knew about it, just to be honest. But Elena grew up in a working class community, and she, with a single mom, she really hadn't left the South at all until some teacher, counselor in her high school, encouraged her to apply, and she got into Yale. So then Elena had to leave for the land of the Yankees. She had to go here. And before leaving to go to school, people weren't at all sure that she should leave and go to Yale, but she did. And before leaving, her grandmother, and here's a picture of Elena and her grandmother, that's Elena on the right there, and that's her grandma in front of their trailer, told her, she gave her this sign to put on her desk, a little placard that said this: better to remain silent and be thoughtful than to speak out and remove all doubt. And you know, this is the sense that, once again, you know your place, fit in, figure out what's going on. Don't put your hand up and mouth off and try to, you know, take control and express your ideas until you know what's going on. Now, of course, if you know Elena today, you would be amazed that this was ever her. But in fact, I know from her advisors at Yale that she did not speak for the first 3 years, and she just sat there. So what becomes clear from those two examples of these different cultural contexts is that, and I started to see this with other students who are struggling to find their voice. Lots of other African American students, lots of Latino American students, Native students, first generation students. I started to see that as different as all of those cultural groups were, as amazingly diverse as they were, and not alike in so many ways, they were alike in that the kind of self that they had most well elaborated was a self, an interdependent self. This is the self that Elena's grandmother wanted her to have. This was the self that Hee-jung had. This was the self that her grandmother thought a good person should have. It's a self that is aware of oneself in relationship. Its relationships define the self. It's a self that finds a way to think about the self as similar to others, and the right way to behave is to adjust yourself to whatever is required in the situation. It's not conforming, mindless conformity, it's adjusting so that you fit in and go along. You're aware of yourself as rooted in tradition, in place, in history, and that feels good. Yet at Yale, where Elena went, and here at Stanford, with both of these students, the kind of self that this institution wants and requires and fosters is a self that we call the independent self. So the independent self wants the individual to be separate from others, unique rather than similar, influencing others with one's own ideas rather than adjusting to them, and actually as much as possible free from tradition, history, and place rather than rooted in these things. Now you can see that what's similar here, both of these, and this, we are social beings. We are selves surrounded by selves. That's the kind of people that we are. I mean, that's whatever kind of self you have. But the nature of your connections, your relationships with others differs depending on which way you are construing the self, or which schema or which model, we can call these, of self is directing your behavior. I say right out, and I hope it's obvious, that both of these ways of being are very good and viable ways to be a self. And all of us, I think, recognize both of them. In order to be a mature, competent human, you have to know how to behave both independently and interdependently. And some of us have had more practice with one way than another, but all of us know these selves. And the short answer to, I think, how we can be better and thrive actually in the multicultural world is the two-self solution, is actually to have develop both of these selves, to know how to use both of these selves, to know how to use which self when, in what situation, and that's and it'll help you understand others' behavior, help you understand your own behavior, and help, I think, avoid some of these conflicts, because our premise is that many conflicts, from big conflicts to from small ones in the classroom, like I was describing, to really big geopolitical conflicts, derive from a clash between independence and interdependence when people don't recognize that that's what's at play here. So just these two ways of being are often unmarked, and they feed into the clash. Not the only factors that are creating the clashes, of course, but important ones. So this is the book, and what we try to do in the book is talk about how the clash of independence and interdependence drives conflict, how our various cultural contexts foster either independence or interdependence, and then we try to talk about how to change cultures, and we have a concept of the culture cycle that I'll show you in a minute as a kind of a way to get a handle on what culture means and then give an idea of how to intervene in culture. And then really to say that the people in power should be the ones that lead the change. And I think that's a message that we try to stress all the way through. Okay, so these are the 8 major clashes that we talk about in the book, and you can see over here in the left-hand column under, you can go down the rows, and you can see which side of the divide fosters independence and which side of the divide fosters interdependence. So I brought these. I thought maybe we could. Oh, geez. I thought maybe you could pass those around, and you could just take a minute. And yeah, thanks, Prudence. And you could fill it out for yourself. And I'll give you. I filled one out for myself, so you can see. So take each divide and ask yourself. You know, hemisphere. Most of us probably have grown up, spent most of our time, worked mostly in the West. So I gave myself a mark for independence. I actually would, I think, give myself a mark under interdependence too, because I spent a fair amount of time in Japan and in the East, in Singapore and in Hong Kong, and I've spent a lot of my life studying those things. So you can get these understandings in lots of different ways. But I identify as female. I'm white. I'm middle class. I've grown up on the West Coast, almost primarily, with some sojourns to the East Coast. Oh, actually, my mark fell off. I'm supposed to have a West Coast here too. I've spent 24 years in Ann Arbor, so I want to give myself a mark here and a mark here, because as you will see if you get into the chapter, it's the here, I'll go back to this where you can look on your sheet. The South and the Midwest foster interdependence compared to the coast. And then as far as religion goes, and here I should make it clear that we're only talking about religions that are prominent in the United States context. I'm not talking worldwide here. But it's mainline Protestants or non-believers. I would foster independence. But conservative Protestantism, Catholicism, Judaism foster a more interdependent view of self. Workplaces is another fascinating culture. If you're an entrepreneur, if you're in business, that will foster an independent self, a way to be successful, the only way to be successful still. Yeah, just a sec, Paula. If you work for a nonprofit like Stanford University, that's relatively speaking will foster more of an interdependent self. And then we see it's questionable. It's questionable because well, it's interesting because you've got to think of the intersectionalities here. Of course, if you get a university out here in the libertarian West, that's probably a little bit more independent than other universities. And then global region. The North, which the North-South divide is essentially a divide between the haves and the have-nots in the world. And the North fosters independence, the South interdependence. And of course, you might say, well, why those 8? These 8 because that's where the data are. We wrote those chapters because there was enough to make the case about these divides. Of course, there are other important, very important divides between gays and straight, between baby boomers and millennials, even between certain kinds of sports teams, push you to be more independent or interdependent. So there's lots of other divides out there, but we picked the ones that we had some goods on. So as people are looking through themselves, you might want to go through and see how you would turn out. So I would turn out, I have another mark there under region, under interdependent. So I would turn out 5 to 4. So I'm kind of a balance, not quite a full balance. In the last chapter of the book, we analyzed Bill Gates. He turns out to be a great exemplar of straight-on independence, although not completely, because he certainly worked in the global South for the last 10 years, and he's had to change a lot of his policies and practices as he's understood that what he set out to do just didn't work. So I could give him a check for interdependence because of the time he's spent working to eradicate malaria, for example, in both South America and in Africa. Then we look at Mother Teresa. Mother Teresa would be almost full-on interdependent. She would get a check almost in every column over there under interdependence, except if you study Mother Teresa's history, you find out that she walked away from her family at age 18. She left home from Albania and she never went back. So that's a pretty independent thing to do. The other thing is she wanted to be a nun without order, which she was granted, which was a pretty independent thing to do. It doesn't really happen. So my point is that all of us are cocktails, are blends of independence and interdependence, and you really kind of have to get into people's history before you know where it is that they would put themselves. And then as a kind of a just showing our cards, Barack Obama comes out as very nice balance. He comes out as fully even. I was nominating Jose David to join him there because he's kind of got a really nice mix of both independence and interdependence based on what we know about him and the cultural context we think he spent time in. The larger point for doing something like this is to say we're doing amazing work in psychology, in scanning and imaging the brain. We're mapping the brain, we're understanding things that we never thought that we could understand, and that's wonderful. But a person is not only a biological being, as I have to tell people in this room, a person is also a social, cultural, historical, political, economic being, and I think that we need to just spend an equal amount of effort scanning, imaging, mapping the sociocultural, historical, political world for the patterns that are there and the way those patterns are shaping our behaviors. And that's really what this is, an initial attempt to say, okay, you can get some handle on all of that complexity out there by thinking, does that context encourage independence more or interdependence more? And bringing those to the fore and recognizing that we know, all of us know how to operate out of both of those cells, although probably most of us have a tendency to be in one direction more than the other. And if you're at Stanford University, I would say, and this is other work, you must have a very well elaborated independent self or go home. So if you don't have one, you better get one. I mean, and any of these things, this is not that hard to help people develop these selves. They might not do it as well at first as someone who's been set up like Bill Gates his whole life to have an independent self, but you need to succeed. Do I think it has to be that way? Pat, hello, Pat Gurin. Does it have to be that way? No, but it is that way now. So in order to get into a place of power so you can change the Stanford University, if that's what we'd like to do, you better get your independent self on. Paula, I'm sorry.
I'm just having a hard
I'm used to not
time.
listening.
Yes,
Ignoring you.
I'm having a very hard time with the 1% being middle class.
Oh, that's a little logo that the book people put on, you know, I didn't do it. You don't have any, I just took that from the book cover, you don't have any choice on what to do on the art here, yes. No, I don't think, it shouldn't be there, and actually I blocked it out later in the presentation, but okay. They just thought that was cute, so, and we did start that chapter with Occupy Wall Street and with talking about that it was class. It was Occupy Wall Street and the 1% that has brought, I think, class to people's attention in the United States in a way that they can actually talk about it. And it's okay to call yourself a first gen now. Earlier today, we were in a discussion and we were saying, you know, people went to school in the 80s. No one called themselves a first gen because almost everybody was first gen, you know, so you didn't talk about it that way, and nobody wanted to call themselves low income or working class. Now the students on our campus do. They want that designation, and that movement is coming from them. Okay, anybody else looking at their chart? I mean, you can see how you think you fall out. Who thinks it doesn't describe them?
What about, you don't have urban rural in there, which is a tremendous one.
Absolutely, but there isn't very good, Herman, there just isn't very good research on it yet, but absolutely, that would be another one of those divides that certainly rural pushes and pulls for a more interdependent self. I just was in Missouri and the students were telling me it's just shocking to go to St. Louis. They just don't know how to be. They can't believe those people who've grown up in St. Louis when they've come from farms. It's you know, that's the first test that they have to do. So what I thought I would do is quickly illustrate one conflict, and then does that sound good?
Yeah.
Okay. I thought it would illustrate gender, because gender is one that everybody's has some experience with. It doesn't leave anybody out. And I would start with this one, and it's still the case, or it is the case now, that gender has taken many forms in different times, in different places. But here and now, in the current US, it looks like this. It looks like women earn more advanced degrees, hold more professional positions, and own or half own nearly half of all US firms. Yet, women earn 77 cents for every man's dollar. They're only 3.6% of Fortune 500 CEOs, and they're only 17% of the US Congress. So a clash of independence and interdependence comes down to men don't invite, and I think women for their part don't insist. And what we see here is this clash of independence and interdependence at work. Men who tend to use their independent side more often haven't exactly invited women to the other side of the glass ceiling. You know, they're just standing there waiting for people to break it from underneath. They could actually help from their side. And then women who tend to use their more interdependent side tend not to insist on equality with their male peers in the ways that they could, although more of that is happening. You know, you talk to any woman who's tried to negotiate her salary. So you know cognitively that you should be emphasizing your individual contributions and your unique talents and strengths, or maybe interviewing for some job you want. But at the same time, you're keenly aware, most women, that you didn't just do this by yourself, that your colleagues and your coworkers were very critical to any work or contributions that you've done. And then you're worried that if you don't cite them and pay attention to them, people will think that you're being too arrogant. And these are very interdependent concerns that most women will voice. And what the data show, the research shows, is that as a result, they ask for less than they know they're worth, and they don't haggle as hard as they might, and they walk away from the negotiation earlier than they should have. And this is clear now. The research also shows that women are often wise to do just that. Because when women act too independently, if they try to lead with their independent self, you know what happens? Backlash. They often face more discrimination than when they are seen as acting properly, which is, you know, more interdependently. So how do we know? And I think that's what we tried to do in the book, is to show how we know this. How do we know that men use their independent side more often, and women more often use their interdependent side? And you might say, well, oh, come on, Hazel, isn't this just a hackneyed cultural stereotype from the 1950s? Aren't we over that right now? Haven't women become much more independent, and haven't men become much more interdependent? And the answer to these questions is that it is a stereotype. It also happens to be true. And although gender roles are changing, hundreds of studies conducted within the past decade, the most recent research, confirm that women still are using their interdependent side, and men still tend to use their independent side, and that's especially true at work. And let me just show you, one of these studies. Look at this one. So here's a little quiz for you. How is this person feeling? This is the reading the mind in the eyes test. Some of you may have taken it. How many people think this person is feeling playful? Raise your hand. Playful. Okay. How many people think this person is comforting? Comforting. So which one do you?
I would say
You say two?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so it was a little bit more towards playful. I would say that the hands, I didn't count. The correct answer is playful. And so this is the mind in the eyes test. It was originally developed as a test of autism. There's 45 such pictures, and they're often more degraded than this, and there's 4 categories of response. So it's actually kind of hard, not just 2. But what the data clearly show, and this came up as a side product of doing this, is that women are much better, one sample after another, at this test than men. And it looks as if they are more socially sensitive, more tuned into emotions, very clear data. And this is, of course, just one facet of interdependence, but it's an example of the kind of thing that we discuss. Let me show you. The point, of course, is that these gender differences aren't biological, they are cultural, and then I just want to say what we mean by culture. Culture we tried to define simply because there's so many definitions of culture, and most people, along with throwing up their hands with diversity, when you say something is cultural, they throw up their hands too, because they think, well, there's nothing I can do about that. But in fact, culture we define as the ideas, institutions, and interactions that guide the thoughts, feelings, and actions of individuals. So we're talking about culture in terms of the four I's that we've put together into a cycle like this. And the point is that you start over here on the left-hand side with individual thoughts, feelings, and actions. So for example, European Americans' use of talking that I started with at the beginning when I couldn't understand He Jung, the idea that talking helps thinking is part of European American culture cycles. That's layered through our pedagogy. The next layer of the culture cycle is interactions, and these include all sorts of unwritten rules, often unwritten rules that guide our interactions with other people and with our everyday products, which includes stories, songs, advertisements, architecture, the internet, all of these things. So for example, the practice of cold calling students that I talked about earlier with He Jung, cold calling them in class to express their opinions is one of those little daily interactions that links talking and thinking in the culture cycles of European Americans. The next layer of the culture cycle is institutions, which organize those everyday interactions, and institutions include government, scientific, religious, philosophical bodies. Our institutions make some interactions possible and they forbid others. For example, a strand in lots of Eastern philosophies is that you learn by following and doing, not by leading or talking, which then shapes many of the educational practices. For example, the Asian students like He Jung learn. And then the final layer of the culture cycle is ideas. And these are ideas like you need to talk to think. This is a very common idea in Western culture cycles, or that men are more valuable than women, or that white people are smarter than people of color. These are ideas that are out there pervasively in our culture cycles. And although these ideas are the biggest drivers often of the culture cycles, it's hard to change them directly. Don't change those ideas directly. You have to work on the institutions, the interactions, the individuals, and then you can shape change those ideas that are undergirding the culture cycle and that create some of this inequality that we're living with. Two things to note about a culture cycle: it's a cycle. Culture is never monolithic, it's always changing, it's dynamic, it's never the same twice. And the most, I think, important part is that individuals are not separate from their cultures, they're part of their cultures. The culture is a product of human agency. Stanford University is a product of individual agency. Maybe all of you don't feel that way, and some of us who've been trying to make up Stanford maybe don't feel that we've had as much impact as we'd like, but nevertheless, the culture's not separate from us. It's a product of psychology materialized. So it shows that if you want to change culture, you can. It's not just out there separate, something that's different from people. It constitutes us. So I'm just going to give you a couple of examples real quick of those, and I told Prudence I'm going to stop, so let me just show you interactions. Let me look at mass media. So we're interacting with all of these cultural products all the time. They have very clear messages with respect to gender for how to be a man or a woman. Researchers have shown again and again that even in children's media, and still today, the hero is usually male, and the story focuses on males leading, standing out, taking control, being unique, saving the world, being an independent self, right? Girls and women, in contrast, what do? They're busy getting saved, which is apparently a full-time job, because that's mostly what they do. And sometimes they get to help and nurture and support men and children. And what you know is that female characters who try to get their own way, and they do often, but what are they? They're witches, they're villains. From Sleeping Beauty to decades of scantily clad bondwomen, the women characters are usually orbiting the edges of the plot, but they seldom make the action happen. And you might once again say, isn't that the old stereotype? No, look at the newest thing. Look at Brave, and this is Disney's a recent Disney film, and it describes Merida, and she's supposed to be a medieval Scottish princess, and she outshoots her male competitors, so she's very independent, but in the process she almost kills her mother. So what is the message? You can be very independent, you can be out there, go ahead girl, but it's at the peril of your relationships. And many other studies at the individual level. How quickly would you pick up this baby? His name's Jonathan, okay? How about this baby? That very same baby is named Andrea, okay? But classic studies that have been replicated many times show that women responded much more quickly to the same baby when the baby had the name Andrea, when the baby had the name Jonathan, and men, it's interesting to note, were equally slow to respond to the baby, whether it was named Andrea or Jonathan. But nevertheless, the point is, on the blank slate of these experimental babies, we are already projecting these interactions that poor little Andrea, we better get to her pretty quickly because she might be a little bit weak. She might need a little bit more help than
more bashing of male parenting.
Yeah, you know me, Gary. That's right. So, what do we say? We say that these are general tendencies. There are always outliers, and I'm glad you're here to stand up for them. So, just move to the institutions. I mean, look at the institutions. They're completely gendered. Who's in charge? Who's influencing others in the government? Who's in the corporate headquarters? Who are in the C-suites? The men. The people doing the caring and the teaching and the relationship building still are the women. And it's not surprising then that many women tend to use the interdependent sides of themselves and men tend to use their independent side. And the important point is this isn't natural, it's not inevitable, it could easily be otherwise. And what we try to do in the book is to talk about how we might go about bridging the gender divide. And what we say is that to bring about changes, we need some kind of meeting in the middle strategy, so that the men need to become more interdependent. They need to help bring the women in. They need to break that ceiling from the other side. It will be good for them too. And then women need to become more independent. The reason we put that in parentheses is that if you look through that chart, you'll see that the people on the interdependent side are pretty much the people with the least power in any of those interactions. So whenever you've got a clash going on, you've got power, less power, and if you're really going to bring about change, it's those with the power that have to do their part. Kind of a simple old idea, but it really shows up very clearly when you divide it in this way. So what can you do to bridge the gender divide? You could promote women to leadership positions. Recent work in business and economics shows that when you add even one woman to the top, to the C-suite, you are going to generate significantly more revenue. This has been the surprise of many of the people doing the studies. You can represent women and their achievement. Let me just tell you one recent study that will be of no surprise to any of you here, but it's kind of a nice little capsule of it. This was done by a Swiss group. They had men and women give a speech like this. Back there by the poster, they put either a picture of Hillary Clinton or a picture of Angela Merkel, or they put a picture of Bill Clinton, or they put no picture. And then they looked at how long men and women spoke, and then they had the speeches coded for their quality by an independent group. And what they found is that women, when there was a poster of a successful woman, either Merkel or Clinton in the back, they spoke twice as long, and the independent group rated their speeches as much better. Then at the individual level, there's all kinds of things to do, but men could listen, and women could speak up. Now, of course, some of us might say there's Sheryl Sandberg, and we might say that women have already been doing a lot on their side. They've been speaking up, and they've been leaning in, and a lot of people might think we've been leaning in so far that we could fall over next. So I'm not saying that women haven't been doing their part, but in order to have this two-self solution, that might be what's required to make both of these selves. So I'm going to stop there because I've already talked too much, but I just tried to give one example and to show how these differences come about from the culture cycles, and to suggest that we could intervene in those culture cycles towards this two-self solution. Thank you.